My son told his friends I was dead. For 3 years, Brendan Novak, Harvard MBA, fund manager at Kellerman & Associates, Cape Cod Yacht Club member with a summer membership that cost more than my annual property taxes, told everyone his father died in 2019. The immigrant bookbinder from Prague was too embarrassing to claim. Too foreign, too quiet. Too much thread under his fingernails, and not enough zeros in his bank account. I only found out when his mother-in-law sent me a sympathy card. A sympathy card. For my own death. Then I discovered he'd stolen my wife's wedding ring, the sapphire I'd saved 2 years to buy Ruth, and sold it online for $2,100. Holding on to dead people's jewelry is pathetic, he said when I called. But the truly pathetic thing was what I found next. $89,000 in credit card debt opened under my name, by my own son. He thought I was too old and too foreign to notice. He was wrong about both. And the $6 million I'd been quietly sitting on? He never saw that coming, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where a bookbinder always starts, with the spine. My name is Walter Novak. I am 66 years old. I bind books for a living, have done so for 48 years. First in Prague under my father Martin's calloused hands, then here in Portland, Maine, in a narrow workshop on Congress Street, where the smell of leather and wheat paste has seeped into the walls so deeply that no amount of paint could ever cover it. The sign above the door reads, Novak Bindery, Est, 1982. Hand-lettered by Ruth, the summer we opened. Her brushstrokes still visible beneath 3 coats of weather and time. The workshop is 11 feet wide and 32 feet deep. A restoration table runs the length of the left wall, scarred with decades of blade marks and glue stains. Shelves line the right side, floor to ceiling. Holding tools my father shipped from Prague, bone folders worn smooth. Awls with handles he'd carved himself, needles so fine they could pass through calfskin without leaving a visible hole. Above the workbench hangs a photograph of Ruth at 23, standing in the doorway with a stack of books balanced against her hip, squinting into the sunlight. The person behind the camera was me. Ruth died 5 years ago. Lung cancer. Not the slow kind that gives you time to prepare. The fast kind. The kind that turns a woman who could shelve 300 books in an afternoon into someone who couldn't lift a teacup by November. She was the head librarian at Portland Public Library for 26 years. She read to our children every night until they were old enough to read to themselves. And even then, she'd sit in the hallway outside their bedrooms, listening to make sure they turned the pages. She was the spine of everything I built. When she went, the binding loosened. But the pages held. I live alone now in the house we bought in 1986, a 2-story salt box on Munjoy Hill with a view of Casco Bay if you lean far enough out the bathroom window. I've kept it exactly as Ruth left it. Her reading glasses on the nightstand. Her cardigan on the hook behind the bedroom door. Some people call that unhealthy. I call it loyalty. The sympathy card arrived on a Tuesday in October. I just returned from picking up supplies, book cloth, Japanese tissue, PVA adhesive, when I noticed the envelope sitting on the counter where my neighbor Ellen leaves my mail. Cream-colored stationery. Heavy stock. The return address read, Prescott, Chatham, Massachusetts, Douglas, and Gloria Prescott. Brendan's in-laws. The people I'd met exactly once. At Brendan's wedding 7 years ago, where Gloria had looked at my suit like it carried a communicable disease, and Douglas had shaken my hand the way you'd handle something vaguely distasteful. I opened the envelope with a bone folder. The way I open everything. A bookbinder doesn't tear. The card featured a watercolor of lilies. Inside, in careful cursive, Dear Mr. Novak, we were so sorry to hear of your passing. Brendan shared the news with us some time ago, and we have kept you and your late wife Ruth in our prayers. May you both rest in eternal peace. With deepest sympathy, Gloria and Douglas Prescott. I read it 3 times, holding the card under the magnifying lamp I use for examining damaged text blocks, as though the additional light might reveal some alternative meaning hidden in the fibers of the paper. My passing. Brendan shared the news. Some time ago. I set the card down beside a 17th century folio I'd been restoring for Bowdoin College, a project that had consumed the better part of 3 years and had become, in ways I couldn't yet explain, the most important work of my life. My hands were steady. They're always steady. 48 years of threading needles through vellum will do that. But something behind my sternum shifted the feeling of discovering that a book you've spent years restoring has been hollowed out from the inside. The cover intact, the spine straight, but the pages gutted. My son had erased me. Not with anger, not with a dramatic confrontation. He'd simply edited me out of his narrative, the way you'd remove a water-stained page from an otherwise pristine volume, quietly, efficiently, without ceremony. I sat in the workshop until the light shifted from afternoon gold to the flat gray of a Maine October dusk. I thought about calling Brendan. I thought about calling my daughter Elise. I thought about doing nothing at all, which is what I'd done for most of my life when faced with my son's particular brand of cruelty. The slow, surgical kind that leaves no visible wound. Instead, I locked the workshop and walked home through the narrow streets of Munjoy Hill. The harbor was darkening. A ferry horn sounded somewhere beyond the islands. The air smelled of salt and wood smoke and the first edge of winter. When I reached the house, I went directly upstairs to our bedroom. Ruth's side of the closet still held her clothes. Her books still lined the shelf above the radiator. And on the dresser, beside the framed photograph of our wedding day, sat a small velvet box. Navy blue, the brass hinge slightly tarnished. I picked it up. I already knew. The way a bookbinder knows when a spine has cracked before he even opens the cover. Something in the weight, the balance, the way it sits in your hand. I opened the box. Empty. The ring cost me 2 years of wages. I want you to understand what that means for a 20-year-old immigrant in 1983 Portland, Maine, a young man who spoke English with a Czech accent thick enough that hardware store clerks sometimes asked him to repeat himself 3 times, who worked 6 days a week in a basement bindery on Exchange Street, for a man named Gerald Hatch, who paid fair wages, but docked 15 minutes of pay for every minute of lateness. 2 years of wages meant 2 years of brown bag lunches and worn-through boot soles, and a single-room apartment on India Street where the radiator knocked every night like someone demanding to be let in. I saved every dollar I didn't spend on rent and food, and the occasional stamp for letters home to Prague. I kept the money in a tin box my father had given me when I left the same box he'd used to hold the tools he couldn't ship, the ones he had to leave behind. By the winter of 1982, the tin held enough. I walked to Stearns Jewelers on Congress Street on a Thursday afternoon in February. Snow coming down sideways off the harbor, and I bought a platinum band with a small natural sapphire, the color of the Vltava River on a clear morning, which is to say the color of Ruth's eyes when the light hit them a certain way. I had met Ruth Callahan 8 months earlier at Portland Public Library, where she worked the reference desk on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. I was looking for a book on the history of Coptic binding techniques. She found it in 11 minutes, and then spent 20 more, telling me why it was incomplete, and which 3 other volumes I'd need to read alongside it. I came back the following Tuesday, and the Thursday after that. By August. We were walking along the eastern promenade after her shifts, watching the harbor lights come on one by one across the water. She said yes before I finished asking. Her exact words were, "Walter, you've been working up to this for 10 minutes. Yes. Obviously. Yes." We were married in May 1983. In the backyard of her parents' house in Cape Elizabeth. 23 people. A borrowed suit. And a cake her mother made from scratch. When I slid the sapphire ring onto her finger, she looked at it the way she looked at a first edition, careful, reverent, like she understood that some things carry more weight than they appear to. She wore it every day for 36 years. I stood in the bedroom for a long time after finding the empty box. Then I did something I am not proud of. I went to my laptop and typed, B. Novak, Deals into the eBay search bar. Elise had shown me how to search eBay years ago, during a phase when I'd been trying to source vintage bookcloth online. I had not used the skill since. I used it now. The listing appeared on the third page of results. Platinum band. Natural sapphire. Antique style. Pre-owned. Minor surface scratches. Engraved interior. Ships in 3 to 5 business days. Asking price. $2,100. Seller. Binovac. Deals. 47 positive reviews. Member since 2021. I clicked on the listing. The photographs were clear and well lit. Whoever had taken them understood that presentation mattered. The ring sat against a white background, the sapphire catching the light. In the fourth photograph, a close-up of the interior band, you could see the engraving. Ruth and Walter. 1983. I looked at that image for a long time. Long enough that the screen dimmed and went dark, and I had to touch the trackpad to bring it back. The engraving was small. I'd paid extra for the precision, the jeweler's hands steady as a surgeon's. 40 years of being worn had softened the edges of the letters slightly but not erased them. Ruth had held her hand up to the light sometimes, reading them the way you'd read a page you'd memorized but still wanted to see. I picked up my phone and called my son. He answered on the fourth ring. Background noise, a restaurant, or a bar. The particular hum of expensive places, where the acoustics are deliberately soft. His voice carried the tone he used when I called at inconvenient times. Which was most times, Dad. Not a greeting. An acknowledgement. Brendan. I kept my voice level. A bookbinder learns early that pressure applied unevenly ruins the work. Ruth's ring is missing from the box on my dresser. A pause. Not a surprised pause. A calculating one. The kind that measures how much you know before deciding how much to admit. I may have grabbed it when I was up there last month, he said. I was going through some of Mom's things. Meant to ask you about it. It's listed on eBay, I said. Under your account. For $2,100. Another pause. Shorter this time. When he spoke again, the calculation was gone, replaced by something flatter. Something that had stopped pretending. I needed the liquidity. It's a ring, Dad. It's just a piece of metal. It has her name on it. Our names. Look. His voice shifted, the particular shift I'd heard since he was 17. The one that meant the conversation was over in his mind, regardless of what I said next. I did you a favor. You've got that box on the dresser like some kind of shrine. It's been 5 years. Holding on to dead people's jewelry is pathetic. Move on. The restaurant noise continued behind him. Someone laughed at another table. Brendan, I'll call you Sunday. He hung up. I sat on the edge of the bed Ruth's side, which I never sleep on, which still holds the faint impression of 40 years of her weight in the mattress, and I held the phone in both hands. Outside the window, the harbor was dark. The ferry lights moved slowly across the water, steady and indifferent. Pathetic. I thought about the tin box my father gave me. I thought about brown bag lunches and worn-through boot soles and a jeweler's hands cutting letters into platinum on a February afternoon in 1983. I thought about Ruth holding her hand up to the light. Then I thought about the sympathy card still sitting on my workbench downstairs. And I understood, truly understood, for the first time that the ring was not the only thing my son had decided I no longer needed. A bookbinder approached damaged work the same way every time. You didn't panic. You didn't mourn. You set the book under the lamp. You examined the damage methodically, and you determined the full extent of what had been done before you touched anything. Rushing the assessment was how you made things worse. Rushing the assessment was how you missed the rot beneath the leather that had already spread to the text block. The morning after Brendan hung up on me, I did not call him back. I made coffee, opened the workshop, and began my assessment. The first call I made was to Gloria Prescott. It took me 20 minutes to find the number. I had to go through old Christmas cards from 7 years ago, back when Brendan still bothered to send them. She answered on the second ring, her voice carrying the particular wariness of someone who wasn't sure which version of a story was about to catch up with her. Mr. Novak. A pause. We weren't sure if you'd call. Your card arrived Tuesday, I said. I'm curious when Brendan told you I'd passed away. A longer pause. I heard her exhale slowly, the sound of someone deciding how honest to be. 2 years ago, perhaps. Maybe longer. He mentioned it at Thanksgiving. He said you and his mother had both gone the same year, that it had been very hard on him, the same year. He'd folded me into Ruth's death, the way you'd hide a damaged page inside a repaired section, close enough to the real thing that no one looked closely. I'm sorry, Gloria said. We should have. Douglas and I both thought it was strange that there'd been no service. No, but Brendan said you'd wanted it private, that there was no family left. No family left. I had a daughter 4 miles from here who called me every other day and came for dinner every Sunday. I had a sister in Prague. I spoke with every Christmas. I had neighbors who brought me soup in winter and borrowed my ladder in summer. Thank you, Mrs. Prescott, I said. I appreciate your honesty. I spent the next 2 hours on my computer. I was not a man who used social media, but I understood its function the way I understood most tools. I didn't need to use a thing constantly to know what it was designed for. Brendan maintained accounts on 3 platforms. I worked through them methodically, going back 4 years. And what I found was consistent and complete. There were photographs of Brendan and Sloan at restaurants in Boston's South End, at a vineyard in Napa, on the deck of a chartered sailboat somewhere south of Cape Cod. There were photographs of Brendan accepting an award at what appeared to be a financial industry conference in New York. There were photographs of Brendan and Douglas Prescott at a golf course in Scottsdale. In every image, Brendan wore the ease of a man who had never once questioned whether he belonged to tailored shirts, the particular tan of someone who vacationed deliberately, a smile that said the room had been arranged for his benefit. In none of these photographs, going back 4 years, was there a single image of me. Not one. I searched his name and mine together, searched the workshop, searched Munjoy Hill, searched Portland. Nothing. I had been excised as cleanly as a page removed with a razor. I called Elise that afternoon. She was between shifts at the hospital, eating lunch in the break room, and I heard her set down her fork before I'd finished the first sentence. Dad. Her voice had shifted into the register she used for serious things, quiet, focused, the way Ruth's had when she needed to think clearly. How long has he been telling people you were dead? At least 2 years. Possibly longer. I'm coming Saturday. You don't need to. I'm coming Saturday, Dad. After we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and wrote down everything I knew. The sympathy card, Gloria's confirmation, the eBay listing, Brendan's response on the phone. I wrote in the methodical way my father had taught me to document restorations, each observation on its own line. Dated, no interpretation, mixed in with the facts. Facts first, conclusions after. It was Elise who suggested I check my credit report. She called back that evening, still in her scrubs. I'm not trying to alarm you, she said. But if Brendan has been representing himself as having no living family, if he had access to the house, Dad, identity theft is more common than people think, especially with elderly parents. I was not offended by the word elderly. I was 66. I had begun to understand that 66, in the eyes of people like Brendan, registered as something closer to irrelevant, a number past which a person's usefulness was considered to have expired. I pulled my credit report online. It took longer than it should have because I couldn't remember the password to the account Elise had helped me set up 3 years ago, and I had to reset it twice. But eventually the page loaded, and I sat in the kitchen under the overhead light with my reading glasses on, and I read 3 credit cards I had never opened. The first, a Visa with a $28,000 limit, opened in March 2022. The second, a MasterCard with a $35,000 limit, Opened 7 months later. The third, a store card with a $26,000 limit. Opened the following spring. All three were linked to an address in Boston's Back Bay that I recognized Brendan's apartment building. Total outstanding balance across all three accounts, $89,200. I had never, in 66 years of life, carried a credit card balance. I paid for everything, in cash or by check. I had no debt. I owned my workshop outright. I'd paid off the house on Munjoy Hill in 2011. I took off my reading glasses and set them on the table beside the legal pad. Through the kitchen window, the last light was going out of the sky over Casco Bay, the water turning from silver to pewter to black. I thought about my father in Prague, teaching me to examine a damaged binding before touching it, to understand the full extent of the problem before committing to a repair. I picked up my pen and added 3 lines to the legal pad. 3 credit accounts. Not mine. $89,200. Then I underlined the last number twice. Slowly, the way you'd score a line into leather. Deliberate. Irreversible. Leaving a mark that wouldn't fade. Elise arrived Saturday morning with a bag of groceries, a laptop, and the expression her mother used to wear when something needed fixing, and no one else was going to fix it. She was 28 years old and worked emergency nursing at Maine Medical Center, which meant she had seen things that would have broken most people and had instead developed a quality I can only describe as practical compassion. The ability to feel deeply while still moving forward. She had Ruth's eyes and my hands, wide-palmed and steady. She set the groceries on the kitchen counter without comment, put the coffee on, and sat down across from me at the table where I'd laid out everything I'd gathered since Tuesday. The legal pad, the printed credit report, the screenshots of Brendan's social media I'd taken with Elise's guidance over the phone, the sympathy card from Gloria Prescott, still in its cream-colored envelope. She went through everything in order, the way she reviewed a patient chart methodically, without reacting to individual items until she'd seen the whole picture. When she finished, she set the last page down flat on the table and looked at me. "Okay," she said, "let's go through the cards." We spent the next 3 hours on it. Elise had brought a spreadsheet she'd built overnight. Columns for date, merchant, amount, location. We entered every charge from all 3 accounts, 247 transactions spanning 19 months. When we finished and the spreadsheet sorted itself into categories, the picture was complete and unambiguous. Restaurants in Boston's South End, averaging $300 per visit. A hotel in New York's Tribeca neighborhood, 4 nights, $2,800. A men's clothing retailer on Newbury Street, multiple visits, total $4,200. A wine merchant in Cambridge, $1,100. A weekend at a resort in Stowe, Vermont, $3,400. And underneath these larger amounts, a constant low hum of smaller charges, car services, coffee shops, dry cleaning, the financial texture of a life lived without attention to cost. None of it was mine. Every charge had been made in Boston or its surrounding area. My credit cards, the 2 I actually possessed, which I'd held since the 1990s, and paid in full every month, showed only my own familiar transactions. Workshop supplies, the grocery store on Washington Avenue, the hardware store on Forest Avenue, the occasional dinner with Ted Gallagher at a restaurant in the Old Port. He opened the first card in March 2022, Elise said, her finger on the spreadsheet. That was 4 months after Mom's funeral. She said it without inflection, but I heard what was underneath it. Ruth's funeral had been small, 40 people. The chapel at the library where she'd worked for 26 years, her colleagues carrying flowers and her favorite books. Brendan had come. He'd worn a beautiful coat and stood at the reception afterward with a glass of wine, accepting condolences with the ease of someone accustomed to being the center of a room. He'd left before the gathering ended, citing an early flight back to Boston. He had not helped me with any of the arrangements. He had not called in the weeks before Ruth died, when I was sleeping in a chair beside her hospital bed, and surviving on cafeteria sandwiches, and the particular exhaustion that comes from watching someone you love become someone you don't recognize. Elise had come. She'd taken 2 weeks of leave, driven up the morning I called her, and didn't leave until Ruth was gone. And I was back in the house on Munjoy Hill, with the refrigerator stocked, and the thank you cards written, and the worst of the paperwork handled. She'd slept in her old bedroom and made coffee every morning, and sat with me in the evenings without requiring conversation. Brendan had sent flowers to the funeral home. A large arrangement, expensive, with a card that read, "With deepest sympathy, Brendan and Sloan." 4 months after that, he opened a credit card under my name. "There's something else," Elise said. She turned the laptop toward me. "I called the credit bureau this morning before I drove up. There's a change of address on file for you, submitted online in January 2022. I looked at the screen. The address listed as my current mailing address was not the house on Munjoy Hill. It was a postal box in Boston's Back Bay, the same zip code as Brendan's apartment building. "He rerouted your mail," Elise said. "Any billing statements, any notices from the credit accounts, they were going to a P.O. box he controlled. That's why you never received anything." I sat back in my chair and looked out the kitchen window at the backyard, where the oak tree Ruth had planted the summer we moved in was losing its last leaves to a November wind off the harbor. She'd planted it from a sapling she'd brought home from the library's Earth Day event, carrying it on the bus in a paper cup, telling me it would be enormous someday, and I shouldn't plant it too close to the house. She'd been right. It was enormous. It was nowhere near the house. Brendan had not simply stolen money. He had engineered a system, applied for the accounts, changed the address, monitored the billing, made the minimum payments when necessary to keep the accounts active, all while the balances grew. It required sustained attention. It required returning to it month after month. This was not an act of desperation or a single bad decision made under pressure. This was architecture. A bookbinder understood architecture. You couldn't fake a well-constructed binding. The tension had to be correct at every point, every signature sewn with consistent pressure, every layer of adhesive applied in the right sequence. Shortcuts revealed themselves eventually. Sloppy work failed in the places it had been rushed. But careful work, careful, patient, deliberate work, could hold for a very long time before anyone noticed the damage. "Dad." Elise's voice was quiet. "You need a lawyer." I nodded slowly. I was already thinking of one. A man named Ted Gallagher, who had been Ruth's closest friend from her library board days, who had practiced elder law in Cumberland County for 30 years before retiring, and who still came into the workshop every few months to have his personal collection rebound. Ruth had always said he was the sharpest person she knew, who charged by the hour. "I know someone," I said. Outside, the oak tree bent in the wind and held. After Elise left Sunday evening, I went to the workshop. It was past 9 o'clock. The street outside was quiet. The last of the weekend foot traffic gone, the city settling into the particular stillness of a Maine November night. I turned on only the lamp above the restoration table, the good one, the one with the daylight bulb that renders color accurately, and I stood in its circle of light and looked at the folio. It sat where it always sat when I wasn't actively working on it, on the far end of the table, wrapped in archival tissue, weighted at the corners with lead blocks to keep the newly consolidated spine flat while the adhesive continued its slow cure. A 17th century devotional text, bound in calf leather over wooden boards, the original covering so degraded when it arrived from Bowdoin College that the library's conservator had photographed every square inch before shipping it to me, afraid the act of packing would cause further loss. That had been 3 years ago. The restoration had taken most of that time, not because the work was beyond me, but because I refused to rush it. A binding this old required patience of a particular kind. You were not simply repairing an object. You were in conversation with the hands that had made it, across 3.5 centuries, and that conversation deserved respect. I had discovered the manuscript 18 months ago. I want to be precise about this, because precision matters in my profession, and because what I found was the kind of thing that, if described carelessly, Sounds implausible. A hidden document inside a book. But books have always been used to hide things: letters, pressed flowers, banknotes, deeds. People have been concealing objects between boards and leather since the first books were made. It was not implausible. It was, in fact, entirely consistent with the period. I had been consolidating the original wooden boards, a process that involves carefully separating the leather covering from the wood beneath in order to stabilize the board itself before relining. The front board had separated from the book block at some earlier point and been reattached, badly, by someone who hadn't known what they were doing. The adhesive was animal glue applied too thickly, the kind of repair that holds for decades before failing catastrophically. When I lifted the leather away from the board with a microspatula, working under magnification, I found the manuscript, 12 leaves of vellum, folded and pressed flat against the inner face of the board, held in place by the original end paper. The ink was brown with age, but fully legible. The script was a secretary hand consistent with the late 16th or early 17th century. The text appeared to be a series of letters, personal correspondence. From the look of the salutations, I set down my tools and sat very still for a moment. Then I photographed every leaf, front and back. Before touching anything further, Dr. Patricia Morse, the rare books librarian at Bowdoin who had commissioned the restoration, drove down to Portland the following week. She brought a colleague from the history department and a conservator from the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem. The four of us stood around my restoration table for 2 hours, passing magnifying glasses and speaking in the careful voices of people who understood that certainty, in this field, was earned slowly. 6 weeks later, Christie's sent an appraiser from their books and manuscripts department in New York. He spent a full day in the workshop. When he left, he shook my hand and said, quietly, that he would not insult me by speculating on value before the authentication process was complete, but that I should retain legal counsel before the next conversation. The authentication took 8 months. The manuscript was genuine, 12 letters written between 1,598 and 1,601, correspondence between two figures, whose names I will not include here, because the legal proceedings were still ongoing, and my lawyer had advised discretion. What mattered, for the purposes of my own situation, was the valuation. $5.8 million at auction, conservative estimate. My contract with Bowdoin, a standard agreement I had been using with institutional clients for 20 years, drafted originally by a lawyer friend of Ruth's, and updated periodically, contained a clause regarding discoveries made during the course of restoration work. 40% of the authenticated value of any previously unknown artifact discovered within a commissioned work to the restorer. The clause had been included as a formality, the kind of language that seemed theoretical when written. It had never been exercised in 20 years of use. 40% of $5.8 million was $2.32 million. Additionally, Bowdoin had responded to the discovery by offering me an exclusive restoration contract for their rare books collection, 10 years, renewable, at a rate that, combined with my existing institutional clients, brought my annual income to a figure I had never expected to see in my working life. I had established the LLC Novak Bindery Holdings with the help of an accountant Elise had recommended. A careful woman named Sandra Park, who had looked at my situation and said, without drama, that the structure was straightforward and the assets were well protected. The total held by the LLC, between the manuscript proceeds and the capitalized value of the long-term contract, was $6.1 million. I had told no one except Sandra and Elise, not because I was ashamed of it, not because I didn't know what to do with it. I had told no one because I had spent 48 years as a bookbinder on Congress Street, and I understood, with the bone-deep certainty of a man who had never confused the cover of a thing with its contents, that the moment certain people learned about the money, they would stop seeing me and start seeing only that. I had wanted to know, first, who saw me without it. Now I stood in the workshop in the November dark, looking at the folio under the lamp, and I thought about Brendan's voice on the telephone. Pathetic. I thought about $89,200 in debt carrying my name. I thought about a sympathy card for my own death. filed neatly in Gloria Prescott's correspondence drawer, alongside thank you notes and birthday cards. I thought about my father in Prague, teaching me that the value of a book was never in its binding alone, that the binding was protection, not substance, and that what mattered was what endured inside. I turned off the lamp. I picked up my phone and found Ted Gallagher's number. It was time. Ted Gallagher lived in a Cape Elizabeth farmhouse that smelled of wood smoke and old paper, which was perhaps why Ruth had liked him so much. He was 70 years old, white-haired, with the particular build of a man who had been athletic in his youth and had since made peace with the passage of time. He had practiced elder law in Cumberland County for 30 years. Wills, guardianship disputes, estate litigation, the full landscape of what happened to people and their assets when they grew old in a society that preferred not to think about it. He had retired 4 years ago and now served on 3 nonprofit boards, tended a large vegetable garden, and brought me books to rebind every few months. Always with the same instruction: take your time, do it right. He opened the door before I knocked. Ruth always said you'd need me someday, he said. Come in. We sat at the kitchen table. He had 2 cups of coffee already poured, which meant he'd been expecting me since I'd called the night before. The farmhouse kitchen was large and practical cast-iron pans on hooks, a wood stove at the far end radiating steady heat, stacks of legal pads on the counter beside a coffee maker that looked older than either of us. I laid everything on the table. The printed credit report, the spreadsheet Elise had built, the screenshots of the eBay listing with the engraving visible, the sympathy card from Gloria Prescott, the documentation of the changed mailing address. Ted put on his reading glasses and worked through the materials in silence. He read the way lawyers read, without expression, occasionally making small marks on a legal pad he'd pulled from the counter without looking up. When he finished, he removed his glasses and set them on top of the pile. The identity theft is federal, he said. 18 U.S.C. Section 1028. Opening lines of credit in another person's name without consent, using a false address to conceal the activity. That's not a civil matter, Walter. That's criminal. I wasn't certain. I am. He tapped the credit report. 3 accounts, 19 months of use. Deliberate concealment through the address change. That's not a mistake. That's a scheme. He paused. There's also the Elder Financial Abuse Statute, Main Title 22, Section 3474. If a person exploits a family member over 60 through financial fraud, the state can pursue it independently of the federal charges. I looked at my coffee cup. He's my son. I know who he is. Ted's voice was not unkind. And I know that changes how this feels. But what he did to you isn't different, because he's your son. It's worse. We sat with that for a moment. Outside, a crow landed on the fence post beside the kitchen window, looked at us briefly with the flat assessment of a bird that has seen enough of human affairs to find them unremarkable, and flew away. There's something else I should tell you, I said. I told him about the manuscript, about the LLC, about $6.1 million, sitting in accounts that Brendan did not know existed. Ted listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, turning his coffee cup slowly on the table. The conservatorship filing, he said finally. Yes. He filed a petition declaring you mentally incompetent. And you are, in fact, sitting across from me in full possession of your faculties, having just described a 3-year restoration project, a manuscript discovery, an LLC formation, and a complex financial structure with complete accuracy. I had help with the LLC. Walter. The corner of his mouth moved not quite a smile. A judge is going to look at this man who told his friends his father was dead, opened $89,000 in fraudulent credit accounts, and then filed for guardianship of a person who just negotiated a $5.8 million manuscript discovery, and that judge is going to have questions. That's what I'm hoping. Ted nodded slowly. He picked up his pen and began writing on the legal pad. You need a cognitive evaluation independent from a neurologist, with no connection to Brendan or to Bowden or to anyone in this situation. That disposes of the conservatorship petition before it gains any traction. He wrote as he spoke. You also need a federal attorney. The identity theft is outside my lane, I can advise you, but I can't file on this. I know someone. Her name is Miriam Chen. She's based in Boston. Practices exclusively in financial crimes and identity theft. She's precise, she's aggressive, and she will make your son's current attorney cry. Does she have experience with elder fraud specifically? She built her practice on it. He looked up. She's also Ruth's second cousin once removed, which means she already thinks well of your family. He paused. Or she did. Before all this, I gave him what must have been an odd expression, because he smiled properly this time. Ruth never mentioned it, I said. Ruth was modest about her connections. It was one of her few flaws. He tore the top sheet from the legal pad and slid it across the table. Miriam Chen's name, a Boston phone number, an email address. I'll call her first. She'll expect to hear from you within the week. I drove home through the November dark. The Cape Elizabeth shoreline giving way to the Fore River. The Portland skyline low and familiar against the sky. The harbor was rough tonight, I could see it from the bridge, whitecaps catching the light from the port, the ferries docked for the evening. I had lived in this city for 48 years, and I still found the harbor settling in a way that was difficult to articulate. Something about the way the water moved, regardless of what happened on the shore. Miriam Chen called at 9:47 that evening. I was in the workshop, not working, just sitting in the chair I kept at the end of the restoration table for the evenings, when I wanted to think in the presence of the tools rather than apart from them. Mr. Novak. Her voice was direct, precise. The Boston accent barely there but present if you listened for it. Ted briefed me. I've pulled a preliminary check on Harrington and Associates. That's the fund where your son works? Kellerman and Associates. Yes, Kellerman. Right. A pause that sounded like typing. Mr. Novak, I need you to understand something before we go further. Go ahead. Your son's problem, she said, is much bigger than you think. I did not sleep that night. I sat in the workshop until past midnight, with the phone on the table in front of me and the legal pad Elise had left behind, adding lines as Miriam spoke. She was methodical and economical with language. The way good lawyers tend to be when they're laying out something serious. No softening, no unnecessary preamble, just the structure of the problem presented clearly, so you could see its full shape before she asked you what you wanted to do about it. I've been watching Kellerman and Associates for 14 months, she said. Not your son. Specifically, the firm. There were irregularities in a complaint filed by an elderly client in Brookline. The SEC forwarded it to our office because the fraud pattern looked like elder financial abuse rather than standard securities misconduct. When Ted called me this evening, I pulled your son's client list. I wrote, Sec. Irregularities. 14 months. How many clients does he manage? I asked. 41 active accounts. The majority are straightforward institutional clients, mid-range portfolios, nothing unusual. But there's a subset. She paused. 6 accounts belonging to individuals over the age of 70, all of whom came to Kellerman through personal referrals from your son, all of whom granted him power of attorney over their financial accounts, which is not standard practice at the firm and should have raised flags internally months ago. Did it? Apparently not sufficiently. Her voice was flat in the way of someone who had seen this before and found it neither surprising nor acceptable. Of those 6 accounts, we've identified 4 where the pattern is consistent with what you've described with your own credit situation. Accounts opened in the client's names without their knowledge. Funds transferred in small amounts to avoid triggering bank alerts. Billing addresses changed to addresses your son controls. I set down my pen. 4 people. 4 that we've confirmed so far. The total unauthorized debt across those 4 accounts exceeds $340,000. The workshop was very quiet. The furnace in the basement of the building ticked as it cycled. On the restoration table, the Bowden folio sat in its archival tissue, patient and still. I thought about the 4 clients, faceless, nameless to me, but not formless. I could construct them easily enough from the details Miriam had given me. Over 70. Trusting. The kind of people who handed their financial lives to someone who seemed capable and were not given reason to question that decision until the damage was done. People like me. Except they hadn't had a daughter who worked emergency nursing and thought to check the credit report. What kind of people are they? I asked. A retired schoolteacher in Newton, 69 years old, widowed. A veteran in his early 80s. Lives alone in Quincy. A married couple in their mid-70s from Wellesley. Both retired academics. And the Brookline woman who filed the original complaint, 78, former librarian. Former librarian. I picked up the pen again but didn't write anything. I just held it, Mr. Novak. Miriam's voice had shifted slightly. Not softer. Exactly. But with a quality of directness that felt deliberate. I need to ask you something. And I need you to think carefully before answering. Go ahead. In the past year, has your son mentioned anything about your ability to manage your own affairs? Your memory? Your daily functioning? Anything that might suggest he's been building a narrative about your mental capacity? I thought about the conversation 3 months ago, when I'd called Brendan to tell him the water heater needed replacing and ask his advice on contractors. He'd said, in a tone I'd registered and then set aside, "You really should think about whether that house makes sense for you anymore, Dad. A man your age, alone in a place that size, it's a lot to manage." I'd changed the subject. He let me. Once, I said. Perhaps more than once. If I'm honest, I thought so. The sound of typing again. Mr. Novak, I'm going to email you something in the next few minutes. I need you to open it and tell me if you recognize the document. The email arrived while we were still on the phone. I opened it on my laptop. The screen bright in the dark workshop. It was a legal filing a petition. Formatted for the Probate and Family Court of Cumberland County, Maine. The petitioner's name was Brendan Thomas Novak. The respondent was Walter Martin Novak. The subject was guardianship and conservatorship. I read the first paragraph twice. Brendan was petitioning the court to declare me an incapacitated person under Maine Title 18C, Section 5 to 102, on the grounds that I demonstrated, and here I read his exact language. Diminished cognitive function, social isolation, resistance to assistance, and an inability to manage complex financial and personal affairs consistent with a person of sound mind. Social isolation. I had 14 institutional clients and had eaten dinner with Ted Gallagher 11 times in the past year. Resistance to assistance. I had refinished the porch railings in September without asking anyone for help, which was not resistance to assistance but competence. Inability to manage complex financial affairs. I had structured an LLC, negotiated a 10-year restoration contract, and managed a $6.1 million asset portfolio without error. When was this filed? I asked. 6 weeks ago, Miriam said. Before you found the ring. Before the credit report. He filed it 6 weeks ago. Which means he had already decided to move on the house before you discovered any of this. The house on Munjoy Hill. The salt box with the blue shutters and the view of Casco Bay. The oak tree Ruth had carried home in a paper cup. Brendan hadn't filed the conservatorship because I'd discovered the fraud. He'd filed it as the next planned step. The mechanism that would give him legal authority over my finances and ultimately, my property. The fraud had been the foundation. The conservatorship was the walls. The house was what he'd been building toward all along. I closed the laptop. He planned this in sequence, I said. It wasn't a question. That's what the timeline suggests. Yes. I looked at the Bowden folio, a 300-year-old book that had survived intact because someone, centuries ago, had built it properly. Good materials, careful technique, sound structure. What Brendan had built was the opposite. It looked sound from the outside. But the inside had been hollowed out, the structure corrupted, and it would fail the moment anyone applied pressure in the right place. I knew how to apply pressure in the right place. "Miss Chen," I said, "what do we do first?" "First," she said, "you get a cognitive evaluation from a neurologist I trust. We kill the conservatorship before it gains any momentum." A pause. "And Mr. Novak, one more question. Your son's wife, Sloane Prescott Novak, how much do you think she knows?" I answered Miriam's question about Sloane the only way I honestly could. "I don't know," I said. "She's never been unkind to me directly. She's been absent. There's a difference." "There is," Miriam agreed. "But absence can be a choice." She told me she would make inquiries through channels I didn't need to understand yet, and that I should not contact Sloane or Brendan in the meantime. No calls, no texts, no emails. Nothing that could be presented later as interference or harassment. I was to behave, she said, exactly as I had behaved before I knew any of this, going to the workshop, restoring books, living my life. "Can you do that?" she asked. "I've been doing it for 66 years, I said. "A few more weeks won't be difficult." After we hung up, I opened the laptop again and read the conservatorship petition in full. It was 11 pages. Brendan had hired a lawyer, a firm in Portland I didn't recognize, which suggested he'd been careful not to use anyone who might know me through Ruth's library connections. The petition was professionally drafted, the language clinical and precise, the kind of document that looked reasonable on paper because it used reasonable-sounding words to describe things that were not reasonable at all. Paragraph 3 stated that I had demonstrated a pattern of social withdrawal and diminished engagement with family, evidenced by my failure to maintain regular contact with my son and his wife. This was presented as a symptom of cognitive decline, rather than the entirely rational response of a man whose son had told people he was dead and stolen his wife's wedding ring. Paragraph 5 stated that I had shown an inability to make sound financial decisions, evidenced by my failure to invest or develop the significant assets available to me through the equity in my property. I had a paid-off house and a profitable business. These were, apparently, evidence of incapacity rather than decades of careful living. Paragraph 8 was the one that required me to set the laptop down and stand at the workshop window for several minutes, looking at the empty street. It stated that I had displayed behavior consistent with complicated grief disorder following the death of my wife, Ruth Novak, including, but not limited to, the preservation of her personal effects in the family home, resistance to changes in daily routine, and an unhealthy attachment to the deceased's memory that had impaired my ability to engage meaningfully with the present. He had turned my love for Ruth into a symptom. I called Elise at 7 the next morning. I read her paragraph 8 over the phone. There was a silence long enough that I checked the connection. Then she said, very quietly, "I'm coming today." "Elise, you have a shift." "I'm coming today, Dad." She arrived at noon, still in her coat, and I handed her the full 11 pages before she'd taken off her boots. She stood in the hallway and read it the way she read trauma charts, fast, thorough. Her face very still. When she finished, she folded the pages in half with a single precise motion and set them on the entryway table. "He used Mom against you," she said. "Yes. He called loving her a disorder. That's the language he chose." She stood there for a moment. Elise did not cry. Easily she had inherited Ruth's discipline about that. The ability to feel something fully without letting it spill into the room. But I saw it move across her face. The thing she was holding back, and I understood that what she was holding back was not grief, but something harder and colder and more purposeful than grief. "What does Miriam say?" she asked. I walked her through it: the cognitive evaluation, the federal investigation, the 4 other victims, the timeline Miriam had reconstructed, showing the conservatorship as the planned 3rd step after the credit fraud and before the foreclosure on the house. Elise listened, standing up, her coat still on, her arms crossed. When I finished, she nodded once. "The evaluation," she said. "When?" "Miriam's scheduling it this week. Dr. Anand Patel, he's a neurologist at Maine Medical. No connection to Brendan or to any of the institutions involved. Miriam has used him before for exactly this kind of case. Good. She finally took off her coat. And after the evaluation, Miriam files a motion to dismiss the conservatorship petition. Simultaneously, she and the FBI's Elder Fraud Unit formalize the investigation into the credit accounts and the 4 other victims. Ted files a complaint with the Maine Attorney General about the financial abuse. Elise hung her coat on the hook beside Ruth's cardigan. She looked at both of them for a moment. "He counted on you not knowing," she said. "He counted on you being too," she stopped. "He underestimated you." "Most people do," I said. "It's a common mistake with bookbinders." She looked at me. Then she laughed, a short, startled sound. The kind that comes when something is both true and absurd, and you don't know what else to do with it. Ruth had laughed like that, low and sudden, like something caught her off guard. We made lunch. Elise made soup from the groceries she'd brought the week before. And we sat at the kitchen table in the thin November light and ate without talking much, which had always been one of the things I valued most about my daughter. She understood that silence between people who trusted each other was not absence, but presence of another kind. After lunch, I went back to the workshop. I had a commission to finish a 19th century family Bible. The spine completely detached, the text block loose, but intact. I set it under the lamp and began my assessment. Running my fingertips along the fold of each signature, checking for hidden damage, mapping the full extent of what needed to be repaired before committing to a single cut. A bookbinder never rushed the assessment. But once the assessment was complete, once you understood exactly what you were working with and what the work required, you didn't hesitate either. You picked up the tools. You began. Brendan had spent 6 weeks building a case that I was too diminished to manage my own life. He had filed it in a courthouse 4 miles from this workshop, using language designed to make my love for my wife sound like a pathology and my quiet competence sound like failure. He wanted to write the last chapter of my story. I picked up my awl and drew it slowly across the leather, marking the line. He was going to be very surprised by who was holding the pen. I built the evidence the way I built every book, from the inside out. The materials came first. I ordered a new blank ledger from my supplier in Boston, cloth-bound, acid-free pages, the kind meant to last. I reinforced the spine myself before I'd written a single word in it, adding a linen hinge along each board join, because whatever this book would contain deserved a binding that wouldn't fail under pressure. Then I assembled everything on the restoration table under the good lamp and began organizing. 5 sections, 5 tabs, cut from colored book cloth and sewn into the gutter of the appropriate page, so they'd lie flat and hold their position across years of use if necessary. A bookbinder didn't assume a document would be needed quickly. A bookbinder assumed it would need to be readable by someone who came to it long after it was made. Tab 1. Identity theft. The printed credit report. The spreadsheet Elise had built, with all 247 transactions, entered and categorized. The documentation of the changed mailing address, date of change, the Back Bay P.O. box number. The IP address Miriam's office had traced to a device registered to Brendan's apartment. Copies of the 3 fraudulent credit applications, obtained through Miriam's federal subpoena, each one bearing a digital signature that matched the account Brendan used for his firm's client communications. Tab 2. The ring. The eBay listing, printed in full with the listing number. The seller account name, the transaction record showing the sale had been completed, and the funds deposited to a PayPal account linked to Brendan's email address. Photographs of the empty velvet box. A photograph I had taken in 1987 of Ruth's hand resting on an open book. The sapphire clearly visible. Tab 3. The false death. Gloria Prescott's sympathy card, in its original envelope. A printout of Brendan's social media accounts, annotated by date, showing the systematic absence of any reference to me from 2020 onward. A written statement from Gloria, which Ted had obtained through a brief phone call she'd been, apparently, relieved to give, confirming that Brendan had told her and Douglas I had died, that he had specified the year 2019, and that he had said there were no surviving family members. Tab 4. The conservatorship. The full 11-page petition, tabbed at paragraph 8. Ted's legal analysis. 3 pages, annotated in his careful hand. Dr. Patel's evaluation results. I want to describe those results briefly, because they mattered to me in a way that went beyond their legal utility. Dr. Anand Patel was a neurologist at Maine Medical Center who had, Miriam told me, testified in 41 elder fraud cases over the course of his career and had never once been successfully challenged on his methodology. He spent 2.5 hours with me in his office on a Wednesday afternoon in late November, and what he found was this: a 66-year-old man with above-average executive function, intact long-term and working memory, no evidence of any neurodegenerative process. And his words, which he'd underlined in his summary report, exceptional attentional capacity and cognitive flexibility consistent with decades of highly skilled detail work. He'd shaken my hand at the end of the evaluation and said, with the mild expression of a man who had seen a great many things, "Mr. Novak, whoever suggested you were cognitively diminished either doesn't know what that means or was hoping you didn't." Tab 5. The other victims. 4 case summaries. Miriam had prepared names redacted per ongoing federal protocol, but ages, account structures, and fraud amounts included. The retired schoolteacher in Newton, $67,000 in unauthorized debt. The veteran in Quincy, $84,000. The retired academics in Wellesley, $112,000 between their 2 accounts. The former librarian in Brookline, $79,000. Total, $342,000. Across 4 people who had trusted my son to manage their financial lives. I closed the ledger and ran my thumb along the spine. It held perfectly. Of course it did. Miriam filed the motion to dismiss the conservatorship petition on a Thursday morning. Ted filed the Maine AG complaint the same afternoon. The federal investigation, which had been building through Miriam's office for 14 months before I ever called Ted Gallagher, incorporated my documentation and formalized its scope to include Brendan specifically, alongside the broader Kellerman irregularities. On Friday evening, Brendan called. I almost didn't answer. Then I remembered what Miriam had said, "Behave exactly as you always have," and I picked up. "Hey, Dad." His voice was warm. Deliberately warm. The specific warmth of someone who has decided, for strategic reasons, to be warm. I had heard this voice before, usually when he wanted something. Just checking in. "How are things up there?" "Fine," I said. "Workshop's busy." "You?" "Good. Good. Really good. Actually. Big quarter coming up." A pause. Conversational. Carefully timed. "Listen, I've been thinking Thanksgiving's coming up. I thought maybe Sloan and I could drive up. Spend a few days. It's been a while. It had been 14 months since Brendan had been to Portland. The last visit had been the one during which he'd helped himself to the contents of my wife's jewelry box. "That sounds fine," I said. "Let me know your plans." "Great." Another pause. "Hey, you doing okay up there? Managing the house all right? I worry about you, you know. Alone in that place." I looked across the workshop at the evidence ledger sitting on the far end of the restoration table. Navy blue book cloth. 5 tabs. Every page acid-free. "I'm managing just fine," I said. "The house is in excellent shape." "Good. Good." He sounded almost convinced. "All right, Dad. I'll be in touch about Thanksgiving. I'll look forward to it," I said. I set the phone down and sat very still for a moment. Outside, the first snow of the season was beginning fine and dry, barely enough to see against the lamplight. But there, the harbor would be gray and flat tomorrow. The islands barely visible. November turning into December the way it always did in Portland. Without ceremony, without asking permission. My phone buzzed. A text from Miriam. 4 words. FBI approved the warrant. I looked at the text for a long moment. Then I set the phone down beside the evidence ledger, turned off the lamp above the restoration table, and locked the workshop door behind me. The snow was already beginning to settle on the window sills. The Sunday before the warrant was executed, I visited Ruth. Eastern Cemetery sits on the slope of Munjoy Hill, a 10-minute walk from the house, old enough that some of the stones predate the Revolution. Ruth had asked to be buried there because she could see the harbor from the hill's crest. And she had always said that if she had to be somewhere permanently, she wanted it to be somewhere with a view. This had seemed, at the time, like the kind of remark a person makes without expecting it to become relevant. It became relevant 3 years later. I brought yellow tulips, which were her preference not because they were in season, they weren't, it was December, but because the florist on Commercial Street kept them year-round, and Ruth had always said that a tulip in winter was a statement of intent. I walked up the hill in the early morning, the snow from Friday still on the ground, the harbor below gray and still, the island sitting low on the horizon like punctuation at the end of a sentence. Her stone is simple, gray granite, her name, the dates, and below them a single line she had chosen herself, years before she was sick, during a conversation about a novel she was reading whose dedication she had admired. The line reads, "She kept all the books." It had made me smile then. It still did. I set the tulips against the stone and stood there for a moment, hands in my coat pockets, and told her what had happened. I told her about the sympathy card, and the ring, and the $89,000. I told her about the conservatorship petition and paragraph 8, where Brendan had described my love for her as a disorder. I told her about the manuscript and the LLC and the $6.1 million she hadn't known existed because I'd found it after she was gone and hadn't had the chance to tell her. I told her about Ted and Miriam and the FBI warrant that would be executed in the morning. The harbor was quiet. A gull crossed overhead without sound. Or perhaps I simply didn't hear it. I thought about the last weeks of her illness, the hospital room on the 4th floor of Maine Medical with the window that faced west, so the afternoon light came in at an angle that made the room seem warmer than it was. She had been reading until 2 weeks before the end. Library books that Elise brought twice a week. Whatever she asked for. In the final days, when reading became too difficult, she'd ask me to read to her instead. I'd read her 3 novels, a collection of poetry she'd loved since graduate school, and the entirety of a natural history of the coast of Maine that she'd been meaning to read for years and hadn't gotten to. She had said something to me 4 days before she died. It was a Tuesday. The light coming in at that afternoon angle. Elise asleep in the chair in the corner after a double shift, and Ruth had been quiet for most of the day, her breathing steady, but shallow, her hand in mine. Then she'd opened her eyes and looked at me with the full lucidity that came and went in those days. "Promise me something, Walter. Anything. Don't make yourself small to keep the peace." She'd squeezed my hand not weakly, with intention. "You've been doing it your whole life. With Brendan. With everyone who looked at you and saw the immigrant with the accent. You made yourself small so they'd be comfortable." Her eyes were very clear. "Stop. You're the best man I know. Stop making yourself small," I had promised. And then the weeks had passed, and the months, and the years, and I had continued, mostly, to make myself small, because old habits are the last bindings to loosen. Standing at her grave in the December cold, I thought, I am keeping the promise now. 40. 7 months late, but keeping it. Elise arrived at the cemetery shortly after 9. She had texted that she was coming, and I'd waited. She walked up the hill with her hands in her pockets, her dark coat a contrast to the white ground, and she stood beside me without speaking for a little while. This was something she had inherited from Ruth, the understanding that some silences were not empty. "How are you feeling?" she asked eventually. "Ready," I said. I considered the word. "I think that's accurate." "Ready." She nodded. She crouched and straightened the tulips against the stone, adjusting them with the same careful attention she gave to everything physical, and then she stood and looked at the harbor. Mom would have found all of this fascinating, she said. From a purely intellectual standpoint, she loved a well-constructed unraveling. She did, I agreed. She had very specific opinions about narrative justice. She would have said Brendan overplayed his hand. She would have said it much earlier than I did. Elise smiled the smile that came from the left side of her face first. Ruth's smile exactly. She would have had it sorted by the second week. We walked back down the hill together, the snow crunching under our boots, the harbor spreading out below us as we descended. I had the sensation I sometimes had when finishing a long restoration, a particular combination of exhaustion and clarity. The feeling of having attended to something that mattered with the full weight of your attention, and being nearly at the end of it. Elise made lunch at the house, and we ate at the kitchen table. And afterward she drove back to Portland proper for her evening shift. I walked through the house, once the study, the bedroom, the kitchen, the back porch where the oak tree stood bare against the December sky, and I thought about the 11-page petition that said I could no longer manage this place, this life, these walls that my wife had painted the color of sea glass in 1992 because she said it made the winter mornings bearable. I sat at the kitchen table and opened my laptop. The email from Miriam was already there. Mr. Novak, everything is confirmed. Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m., Boston Field Office executes the warrant on Kellerman and Associates. Brendan's office will be included in the sweep. You don't need to be there. You don't need to do anything. Just go to work. I read it twice. Then I closed the laptop, turned off the kitchen light, and went upstairs. Outside, the harbor was dark. The oak tree was still. Tomorrow was Monday. Monday morning, I opened the workshop at 7. This was not unusual. I had opened the workshop at 7 every weekday for 44 years, with the exception of the 2 weeks surrounding Ruth's death and a single January during which a water pipe had burst in the building's basement and flooded the lower floor. On both occasions I had returned as soon as I was able, because the workshop was where I thought clearly, and thinking clearly was what the situation required. I made coffee on the small electric kettle I kept on the shelf beside the bookcloth samples. I turned on the lamp above the restoration table. I unwrapped the Bowden folio from its archival tissue and sat down to continue work on the final section of the lower board. A delicate process of consolidating the original wooden substrate before applying the new leather covering that would protect it for the next century or two. At 9 o'clock, I picked up a microspatula and began. I want to describe what I was doing at the exact moment the warrant was being executed in Boston because I think it matters. I was working under magnification, using a 2mm spatula to coax a fragment of original end paper back into alignment with the board beneath it, applying pressure with the ball of my thumb at precisely the right angle to bond the surfaces without creating a ridge. It required absolute stillness of hand and absolute focus of attention. The fragment was 300 years old and had no more chances left in it. Miriam called at 9:43. "It's done," she said. "They're in the building. His office is being swept right now." I set down the spatula and took off my magnifying visor. "And Brendan?" "In custody. He was at his desk when they arrived." A brief pause. "He apparently asked if he could call his father-in-law. The agents told him he could call his attorney." I thought about Brendan at his desk on the 14th floor of a financial district tower, watching FBI agents come through the door with a warrant and reaching first for Douglas Prescott's name rather than a lawyer's. Even now, in the moment of total exposure, his instinct had been to reach for someone else's money and someone else's protection. "The other victims?" I asked. "Their cases are formally incorporated into the investigation as of this morning. They'll be contacted by the field office today." She paused again. "There's going to be press, Mr. Novak. Not immediately, but by this afternoon. The arrest of a licensed fund manager on elder fraud and identity theft charges it'll be picked up by the local stations. Possibly the Globe. I understand. Go back to work," she said. That's all you need to do. I put the visor back on and went back to the end paper fragment. At 11:15, Sloane called. I had been expecting this. Or something like it. The call from the periphery. From someone whose life was collapsing, along lines adjacent to the ones I had drawn. I let it ring 4 times. Which was not avoidance, but consideration. Miriam had said not to contact Brendan or Sloane. She had not said I couldn't answer if they called first. Michael. Her voice was unsteady in a way I had never heard from her. Sloane Prescott Novak had been composed in every previous interaction. Composed at the wedding, composed at the one Thanksgiving they'd spent in Portland, composed in the way of people who have been taught since childhood that displaying emotion is a form of weakness. The composure was gone. What did you do? I told the truth, I said. That's all. There are FBI agents in his office. They took his computer. They're talking about charges. Her voice broke slightly on the last word, controlled quickly. But I heard it. He called me and he wasn't making sense. He kept saying it was a misunderstanding. I looked at the Bowden folio under the lamp. At the end paper fragment, I'd spent the last 2 hours persuading back into its proper position. 300 years old. Still capable of being restored. If the work was done carefully, and with respect for what it had endured. Sloane, I said. It wasn't a misunderstanding. You should speak to a lawyer of your own, not the firm's lawyer, and not whoever Brendan is calling. Someone who represents only you. A silence. Then, what has he done? All of it. What has he actually done? I thought about what Miriam had said, that Sloane's level of involvement was still being assessed. I thought about what I actually knew, which was that Sloane had stood beside Brendan at every dinner and every gathering where he had treated me as furniture, and that this did not make her guilty of fraud, but did not make her innocent of other things. Talk to a lawyer, I said again. Today, she hung up without another word. At 2 in the afternoon, Elise texted, Dad, turn on Channel 6. I didn't own a television in the workshop. I pulled up the station's live stream on my laptop and watched for 3 minutes, long enough to see the anchor, long enough to read the chyron at the bottom of the screen, long enough to see the photograph they'd used. Boston fund manager arrested on federal elder fraud and identity theft charges. Kellerman and Associates under SEC investigation. Multiple victims identified across Massachusetts and Maine. The photograph was Brendan's professional headshot from the Kellerman website, the one I'd seen during my research 2 months earlier, the one where he wore the expression of a man who believed the room had been arranged for his benefit. They'd put it in the upper right corner of the screen, beside the anchor's shoulder, the way they displayed photographs of people the public needed to know about for reasons that were not flattering. My son's face on a television screen in a breaking news chyron. I closed the laptop. I sat in the workshop for a moment, listening to the particular quiet of a Monday afternoon on Congress Street. A delivery truck idling somewhere on the next block, the distant sound of the harbor, the furnace ticking in the basement. Then I put the visor back on, picked up the microspatula, and returned to the end paper fragment. It still needed finishing. The work didn't stop because the world had rearranged itself outside the window. The work was always there, patient and specific, requiring the same attention it had always required. 300 years old. Still worth restoring. I pressed the fragment gently into alignment and held it there. By Tuesday morning, it had spread beyond the television stations. The Boston Globe ran a piece online at 6:45, not front page, not yet, but prominent enough, under the business section header, Fund manager faces federal elder fraud charges. SEC expands Kellerman investigation. The article named Brendan. It named Kellerman and Associates. It listed the charges: identity theft, wire fraud, elder financial abuse. It noted that the investigation had originated from a complaint filed by a client in Brookline and had expanded to include victims in multiple states. By 8 o'clock, it had been shared 900 times. I read it over coffee in the kitchen, then set my phone face down on the table and looked out the window at the oak tree. The snow from the weekend had mostly melted, leaving the yard gray and bare, the tree standing in its usual posture of patient endurance. Ruth had planted it 38 years ago. It had outlasted harder winters than this. The calls began arriving at the workshop by mid-morning. Not from Brendan, not yet, but from people on the periphery of the situation who had seen the news and were processing it in the way that people process things that land close to their own lives. 2 former colleagues of Ruth's from the library, calling to ask if I was all right. Ellen from next door, who had clearly read the article and was tactfully not saying so. Ted Gallagher, briefly, to confirm that the Maine AG's office had acknowledged receipt of his complaint and was moving forward. And then, at 11:40, a call from a number I didn't recognize, a Boston area code. Mr. Novak. A woman's voice, careful and deliberate. My name is Dorothy Marsh. I'm calling because the article this morning mentioned Maine victims, and my mother, is Evelyn Park. She's 78. She lives in Brookline. She's the one who filed the original complaint. I sat down on the stool beside the restoration table. Mrs. Marsh. Yes. I know who your mother is. A long exhale. I wanted to thank you. I don't fully understand what you did or how you did it. But the agent who called us this morning said that your documentation, the materials you provided, is what formalized the investigation. My mother has been living with this for 8 months. She was too ashamed to tell most of our family. She trusted him. She thought he was helping her. I thought about Evelyn Park, 78 years old, former librarian. I thought about 8 months of opening mail she couldn't understand, of numbers that didn't correspond to anything she'd agreed to, of the particular shame that comes from being deceived by someone you trusted, in a context where trust was the whole point. Your mother did the right thing by filing the complaint, I said. Everything else followed from that. After we hung up, I added Dorothy Marsh's name to the legal pad I kept beside the phone. By the end of the day, 3 more families had called. The veteran's daughter from Quincy, a nephew of the retired academics in Wellesley, a woman who identified herself only as a former Kellerman client who had seen the article and suspected her own accounts had been compromised. Miriam had said possibly 4 victims. By Tuesday evening, it appeared the number was still growing. Kellerman and Associates released a statement through their communications firm at 3 in the afternoon. The firm was cooperating fully with the investigation. Brendan Novak had been placed on immediate administrative leave, pending the outcome of proceedings, and the firm was committed to the highest standards of client care. It was the statement of an institution protecting itself, which was the only statement such institutions ever released. Brendan's name appeared in it twice, both times followed by the word allegedly. Douglas Prescott's statement came through different channels. Elise texted it to me from a Cape Cod Society page that had picked it up, a brief paragraph released through his personal attorney, noting that Douglas Prescott had no knowledge of, and in no way condoned the alleged activities of his former son-in-law, that he was fully cooperating with all relevant authorities, and that he considered his relationship with Brendan Novak to be permanently severed. Former son-in-law. Permanently severed. Elise's accompanying text read, Douglas Prescott moves fast when his reputation is threatened. I replied. He and Brendan had that in common. She sent back a single punctuation mark. A period. Which was, I had learned over 28 years of being her father, her most efficient expression of complete agreement. The call from Brendan came at 6:47 that evening. It came from a number I didn't recognize, and when I answered, there was the particular acoustic quality of a phone call made from a room that was not designed for privacy, flat, slightly echoic, voices in the background that stopped just short of being distinguishable. Dad. His voice was stripped of every register I was accustomed to, the warmth he performed, the impatience he didn't bother to hide, the easy confidence that had been his primary mode of presenting himself to the world for as long as I could remember. What was left was something thinner, something that sounded, for the first time in as long as I could recall, genuinely young. Dad, I need help. I need you to. My lawyer is saying the evidence package, whatever you gave them, it's He's saying it's comprehensive. He needs to know if you'd be willing to. Brendan, I said, if you would just talk to them, tell them that this is a family matter, that we can resolve it privately, that you don't want to. Brendan. I said his name again, quietly. The way you'd apply pressure to a damaged binding evenly, without force, just enough to stop the movement. He went silent. You told everyone I was dead. A pause. You told your mother-in-law I had died. You said there was no family left. I kept my voice level. I was standing at the workshop window, looking at the street below. The December dark coming on early the way it did in Maine, the streetlights reflected in the wet pavement. Dead men can't help you, Brendan. You made certain of that yourself. The silence on the line lasted long enough that I thought the call might have dropped. Then, very quietly, he said, I didn't think you'd... I know, I said. That was your mistake. I ended the call and set the phone down on the restoration table, beside the evidence ledger with its 5 cloth tabs. The workshop was warm. The lamp above the table cast its steady light across the folio. The tools, the careful, accumulated order of a working life. Outside, the December dark deepened over Portland Harbor. Somewhere out there, the ferries were making their last crossings of the evening, running their fixed routes through whatever the weather offered, steady and purposeful. I turned off the lamp and went home. The letter from Sloan arrived on a Thursday, 12 days after the arrest. It came in a plain white envelope. No return address. Postmarked from Chatham, Massachusetts, her parents' town. Which meant she had already left Boston, already left the apartment on Commonwealth Avenue, where she and Brendan had lived for 6 years. The handwriting on the envelope was careful and slightly uneven. The handwriting of someone who had started over twice before settling on how to form the letters. I opened it at the kitchen table, with coffee. On a morning when the harbor was the color of old pewter and the light came in flat and clear through the window over the sink, she had written 4 paragraphs on plain notepaper. No letterhead. No decoration. The pen she'd used had run slightly dry toward the end of the second paragraph, and she hadn't started a new one. She'd pressed harder and continued, which told me something about her state of mind when she wrote it. She wrote that she had known, in the vague and practiced way of someone who had decided not to look directly at things, that Brendan was not always honest. She wrote that she had told herself the gaps in his accounting, the occasional unexplained expenses, the way he deflected certain questions, were the normal texture of a high-pressure career in finance. She wrote that she had let herself believe this because believing otherwise required a courage she had not, at that time, possessed. She wrote that she had not known about the credit accounts. She wrote that she had not known about the conservatorship petition. She wrote that when she learned, when the FBI agent sat across from her in a conference room in Boston and laid the documents on the table one by one, she had understood that the life she'd built had been constructed on a foundation she'd never examined because examining it would have meant dismantling it. She did not ask for forgiveness. The 4th paragraph was 3 sentences. I filed for divorce last week. I've moved into my parents' house while I find my footing. I wanted you to know I'm sorry not only for what Brendan did, but for what I did, which was stand beside him for 7 years and look past you. I read the letter twice. Then I folded it along its original creases and set it beside my coffee cup. I called Elise that evening. I read her the last paragraph over the phone. There was a pause on the other end of the line, not a calculating pause, but a genuine one. The pause of someone receiving new information and making room for it. She's trying, Elise said. Yes. That doesn't fix anything. No, I agreed. But it's not nothing. I thought about Ruth's words at the graveside, not the ones she'd said to me before she died, but the ones I'd said to her 3 weeks ago, standing in the December cold with yellow tulips against the gray stone. I had told her everything. I had laid it all out. The whole of it. And asked her without expecting an answer whether I was doing the right thing. The right thing, I had concluded standing there, was not a single action, but a direction. You chose the direction, and then you kept moving in it. And some of what you encountered along the way was expected. and some of it was not. Sloane's letter was not expected, but the direction it pointed was one I recognized. Through Ted's office, I quietly arranged legal assistance for 3 of the 4 identified victims: the retired schoolteacher in Newton, the veteran in Quincy, and the former librarian in Brookline, covering their attorney fees through the LLC without attaching my name to the arrangement. The retired academics in Wellesley had adult children who were handling their case directly. I didn't contact any of the victims personally. What they needed was not to know me, but to have the resources to fight, and that I could provide without making it about anything other than what it was. Miriam called on a Tuesday in early January. His attorney approached the DA's office, she said. They're discussing a plea. What kind of plea? Identity theft on 4 of the 5 counts yours, plus the 4 confirmed victims. Wire fraud, 2 counts. Elder financial abuse, 3 counts. In exchange, they're asking the DA to drop the remaining charges and recommend against incarceration beyond time served. I thought about time served. Brendan had been in federal custody for 3 weeks. He had spent those 3 weeks in a situation he had never anticipated. In a room without a view, without a tailored shirt, without the specific ease of a man who had never once questioned whether he belonged somewhere. What does Miriam recommend? Elise asked when I told her that evening. She says a plea means the victims receive restitution faster. A trial could take 18 months, possibly longer, during which Brendan's attorneys would challenge every piece of evidence and drain every resource the victims had available for legal fees. The plea is less satisfying but more efficient. Elise was quiet for a moment. What do you want? I looked around the kitchen. The window over the sink that Ruth had always said was the best thing about the house. The way the light came through it on winter mornings. The oak tree in the backyard, bare now but present, the root system extending deep into the frozen ground. I want the families to get their money back, I said. Everything else is secondary. The plea was formally entered on a Wednesday morning in federal court in Boston. Brendan Novak pleaded guilty to identity theft, wire fraud, and elder financial abuse across 9 counts. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks out. Miriam texted me at 10:43. Done. Sentencing February 14th. I'll need you in Boston. I set the phone down on the restoration table and looked at the Bowden folio, nearly finished now. The new leather covering fitted and burnished, the manuscript leaves safely documented and housed separately in archival conditions. 300 years of survival, restored to as close to its original integrity as skill and patience could achieve. The work had taken 3 years. Some things could not be rushed. The sentencing was 6 weeks away. I picked up my tools and went back to work. The federal courthouse in Boston was a building designed to communicate authority, granite and glass, wide steps, the particular coldness of spaces built to remind you that what happened inside them was larger than any individual present. I arrived at 8:45 with Elise beside me, and Miriam waiting at the bottom of the steps in a dark coat, a leather folder under her arm, her breath visible in the February air. You don't have to go in if you don't want to, Miriam said. This was not something she believed I could tell from the way she said it. The slight formality of the phrasing, that it was something she said to all her clients before sentencing hearings, a professional courtesy, the acknowledgement that the choice remained yours even after everything had been set in motion. I want to go in, I said. The courtroom was on the 4th floor. Wood paneling, fluorescent light softened by shades designed to suggest something warmer. The same acoustic quality I remembered from Ted's description of the space words landing with a slight flatness, as though the room absorbed them and kept them. The gallery was more occupied than I'd expected. Families of victims I recognized from descriptions Miriam had given me. 2 journalists with notepads. A row of Kellerman employees I didn't know. Brendan was already at the defense table when we entered. He didn't turn around. He sat with his attorney on his left. His posture, the posture of a man who had spent the past 6 weeks learning that certain rooms could not be managed by confidence or charm. He was thinner. The suit he wore was not the kind he had previously owned it fit, but only approximately, the way clothes fit, when someone else has chosen them in a hurry. He had not had a haircut in some time. These were not details I observed with satisfaction. I observed them the way I observed the condition of a book brought in for restoration accurately, without editorial. The victim's statements came first. Dorothy Marsh read her mother Evelyn's statement. Evelyn Park, 78. Former librarian. The woman who had filed the original complaint 8 months before any of us were in this room. Dorothy's voice was steady. She read about the letters Evelyn had received from collection agencies for debt she hadn't known existed. The months of confusion and shame. The night she had sat at her kitchen table with a calculator trying to make numbers add up that she hadn't created. She read the last line of her mother's statement twice. I trusted him because he said he wanted to help. I will not trust that way again. That is what he took from me. The veteran from Quincy spoke for himself. He was 81 years old, using a cane, and he stood at the podium for 6 minutes without notes and said, in a voice that had no tremor in it, that he had served 2 tours and come home and built a life and managed his own affairs for 60 years and would like the court to understand what it meant to have that capacity called into question by a fraud he hadn't caught. He did not cry. He did not ask for sympathy. He simply stated the facts of what had been done to him in plain language and sat down. The retired academics from Wellesley. The retired school teacher from Newton, whose daughter read for her. Each statement a different shape of the same thing: trust extended, exploited, and permanently altered. When the judge asked if I wished to make a statement, I declined. Miriam had prepared one in case I changed my mind. 3 paragraphs, measured and precise. The kind of statement that would have looked good in the court record. I had read it twice and decided it was not necessary. The victims had said what needed to be said. My adding to it would have been about me, and this was not about me. Or rather, it had begun because of what had been done to me. But it had always been larger than that, and I wanted the room to remain aware of that largeness. The sentence was 18 months in federal custody, to be served at a minimum security facility in Cumberland, Maryland. Restitution of $431,200 to the 7 confirmed victims, to be paid from the liquidated assets of Brendan's personal accounts and investment portfolio. 3 years of supervised release following incarceration. Permanent revocation of his financial industry licenses. The judge read the sentence in the flat tone of someone who understood that what they were saying would land differently on each person in the room and was accounting for none of those differences specifically. Brendan said nothing when the sentence was read. His attorney had prepared him for this. I could see the preparation in the way Brendan held himself very still, the deliberate quality of his non-reaction. But when the marshals moved to escort him from the courtroom, he turned. He found me immediately, across the rows of gallery seating. I don't know what he was looking for in my face. I don't know what he found there. I had not arranged my expression for his benefit in either direction. I simply looked at him, my son, 34 years old, being led out of a federal courtroom on Valentine's Day in a suit that didn't quite fit. I did not look away. Neither did he, until the door closed between us. Elise and I walked out into the February cold. The harbor was visible from the courthouse steps, a different harbor than mine, Boston's harbor, wider and more industrial. But water is water, and it moves the same way everywhere. Are you all right? Elise asked. I think so, I said. Yes. We drove back to Portland in the afternoon. I returned to the workshop. I finished the final passes on the Bowden folio, the last consolidation, the final burnishing of the new leather covering, the careful application of a conservation-grade coating that would protect it for the next 100 years without altering its appearance. Then I wrapped it in fresh archival tissue and set it on the shelf to rest. 3 months later, a letter arrived from a federal correctional facility in Maryland. The handwriting on the envelope was my son's. I held the envelope for a long time before opening it. This was not hesitation. I had learned, over 66 years of working with my hands, the difference between hesitation and deliberateness. One comes from fear, the other from respect for the weight of a thing. I held the envelope the way I held a fragile text block before committing to the first cut. Understanding that once you began, there was no going back to before. The letter was 3 pages, written in blue ink on lined paper of the kind issued by federal correctional facilities, narrow margins, pale blue lines, the paper slightly rough to the touch. Brendan's handwriting was smaller than I remembered from the rare occasions I'd seen it on birthday cards or Christmas checks, tighter and more compressed, as though he'd become careful about the space available to him. He did not begin with an apology. I noticed this. He began with a statement. I am writing this because I have been in this room for 11 weeks, and I have run out of ways to avoid thinking about certain things. He wrote about being 12 years old when Ruth died, when his mother died. He called her his mother, which she had always been, and which I had never doubted, but which he rarely acknowledged in those terms. He wrote about standing at her grave in the same Eastern cemetery where she was now buried, in a suit that was too large for him, and feeling something he couldn't name then and was only now, 34 years old in a correctional facility in Maryland, beginning to find words for. He wrote, I was ashamed of you before I understood what shame was or where it came from. You spoke English with an accent and your hands always had something under the nails. And you drove a car that was 10 years old. And when other kids' fathers came to school events, they wore suits. And you wore your work apron, and you apologized for it. I watched you apologize for existing in rooms where other people didn't apologize for anything, and I decided that was the problem. I decided you were the problem. And once I decided that, I spent 20 years building a life that proved it. He wrote about the Harvard MBA, about Sloan, about Douglas Prescott and the Yacht Club and the Financial District Office. He wrote that he had understood, somewhere below conscious thought, that these things were not evidence of his own worth, but props in an argument. He was making an argument that the distance he'd put between himself and a narrow workshop on Congress Street was meaningful, that the accent he'd been embarrassed by in childhood could be erased by enough marble and leather and correct pronunciation. He wrote, What I did to you with the loan, and the credit accounts, and the conservatorship, I'm not going to call it a mistake, because that lets me off a hook I shouldn't be off. I knew what I was doing. I chose it. Every step. Over a long time. And the only explanation I can offer that isn't an excuse is that I had confused hurting you with surviving something. I hadn't survived anything. I had just hurt you. The last paragraph was 4 sentences. I don't expect a response. I don't expect anything from you. I wanted to say this while looking at it clearly, which I can apparently only do from here. I'm sorry, Dad. Not for what I lost, for what I chose. I read the letter twice. Then I folded it along its original creases and placed it in the small wooden box I kept on the bedroom dresser. The same box that had once held Ruth's sapphire ring, the box that had stood empty for months until I'd quietly repurchased the ring through the eBay seller's account, paying $2,100 for what was mine, and returned it to its place. The letter went in beside the ring. I closed the lid. I called Elise that evening and told her about the letter. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she asked, Did it say what you needed it to say? I thought about this carefully. It said what he needed to say. I'm not sure those are the same thing yet. Are you going to write back? Not yet. I paused. Maybe not for a long time. Maybe not at all. But I'll keep the letter. She understood this. She'd inherited Ruth's understanding of the difference between an open door and an unlocked one. The Novak Bindery Fellowship launched the following month a scholarship fund, seeded with $500,000 from the LLC, administered through the Maine College of Art and Design and the Southern Maine Community College. 3 recipients in the first year, each receiving full funding for a 2-year program in traditional craft and conservation. The eligibility criteria were straightforward. First, Generation Americans, enrolled in a vocational or craft-based program demonstrating financial need. The application asked one question beyond the standard requirements. Describe something you learned to do with your hands and what it taught you. The answers I read in the applications were the best reading I had done in years. The phone call came on a Tuesday afternoon in May, 6 months after the sentencing. while I was consolidating the spine of an 18th century atlas commissioned by a private collector in Bar Harbor. The number was a main area code I didn't recognize. Mr. Novak? A young woman's voice, slightly formal. The formality of someone who had rehearsed the opening. My name is Ruth. Ruth Gallagher. I'm Ted's granddaughter. I set down the microspatula. Ted has mentioned you, I said. I know. He talks about your workshop, about the work you do. I've been thinking about it for a while. And I was wondering if you ever take apprentices. Or students. I'm not sure what the right word is. A brief pause. I'm 22. I study English literature at Bowdoin. But what I actually want to do is learn how books are made. Properly made. The old way. Another pause. Shorter. Ted said you were the best bookbinder in New England, and that if you turned me down I should ask again. Despite myself, I smiled. Ted Gallagher had known exactly what he was doing. Giving his granddaughter that particular instruction. Come on Saturday, I said. 8 o'clock. Bring nothing. You'll learn faster without assumptions. After we hung up, I sat in the workshop in the May afternoon light, the atlas open on the table before me, the harbor visible in the distance through the single window that faced south. Her name was Ruth. Of course it was. Ruth Gallagher arrived at 7:58 on a Saturday morning in May, which told me something about her before she'd crossed the threshold. She was 22, slight. With Ted's eyes the particular gray-green that his family apparently carried, and the posture of someone accustomed to spending long hours over books. She wore practical clothes. Old jeans, a canvas jacket, boots with actual soles. She carried nothing. As instructed, she stood in the doorway of the workshop and looked at the space the way I had hoped she would, not impressed. Not overwhelmed, but attentive. Taking inventory, the eyes moving from the tools to the shelves, to the restoration table, to the folio currently laid open under the lamp. Methodical in the way of someone who understood that looking came before touching. The smell is different than I expected, she said. What did you expect? I'm not sure. Something mustier. This is cleaner. More animal. Leather, I said. And linen thread, and wheat paste, and a decade of linseed oil in the wood of the table. You'll stop noticing it within the hour and miss it when you leave. She nodded as though filing this away. Then she walked to the restoration table and stood at the appropriate distance, not too close, not hanging back, and looked at the text block I'd been working on without reaching toward it. I liked her immediately. I didn't say so. We began that morning with the fundamentals, the anatomy of a book, the vocabulary of the craft, signature, gathering, text block, boards, spine, headband, paste-a-down, the names of the tools and their purposes, the order in which materials were prepared, the logic that governed every decision in a binding. Ruth had a background in literature, and so she understood that structure was not separate from meaning, that the way a book was held together affected how it was experienced, that the physical object carried the intellectual content, and that both mattered. She asked good questions. Not many, but good ones. The kind that came from listening, rather than from wanting to demonstrate that she'd been listening. By the end of the first Saturday, she had folded her first signature correctly. Bone folder moving in the sequence I'd shown her without hesitation. The fold clean and true. She held it up and looked at it, a small thing. 8 pages of good paper folded once, with the expression of someone who has made something with their hands for the first time and discovered that this is different from other kinds of making. Same time next week? She asked. Yes, I said. And bring the same nothing. She came every Saturday through June and into July. She was a quick learner with the particular patience of someone who had read enough difficult books to understand that comprehension sometimes required waiting for the thing to become clear rather than forcing it. By the end of June, she had sewn her first text block imperfectly, the tension uneven in 2 places. But she'd found the errors herself before I'd pointed to them, which was the more important skill. Sloane came to Portland on a Wednesday in late June. She had texted the week before to ask if she could stop by the workshop. Not the house. The workshop, which I understood was a deliberate distinction, a way of signaling that she was not presuming on anything domestic or personal. She arrived at noon, looked around the space with an expression I couldn't immediately categorize, and sat on the stool I indicated, without rearranging herself to be comfortable, which I took as a sign of genuine discomfort, honestly felt rather than performed. She had changed in the month since the arrest, less polished. As Elise had noted from a brief phone conversation, fewer of the particular accessories that had previously seemed integral to how she presented herself. Hair simpler, the specific ease of expensive maintenance absent. What replaced it was not dishevelment, but something more honest. A woman in her early 30s who had recently discovered that the architecture of her adult life had been built on something false and was now living in the open air of that discovery, which was uncomfortable, but not, it turned out, unsurvivable. She was working, she told me, as a paralegal at a small firm in Hyannis that specialized in consumer protection. She had passed her paralegal certification in March. She was helping with 3 ongoing cases related to financial fraud against elderly clients. All of them found through a nonprofit that Miriam Chen had quietly pointed her toward. "It's not enough," she said. "I know that." "It's not nothing," I said. The same thing I'd said to Elise about Sloane's letter, months ago. She looked at me carefully. "Ted told me you said that. Ted talks a great deal for a retired man." Something shifted in her face, not quite a smile, but the precondition for one. "He speaks very highly of you. He speaks highly of everyone he likes and says nothing about people he doesn't. It's an efficient system." We had coffee. We talked for an hour, carefully, without pretending that the carefulness wasn't there. She asked about the fellowship, and I told her about the 3 recipients and the application question and the answers I'd read. She asked about Elise. She did not ask about Brendan. I did not ask about Douglas Prescott. Some subjects did not need to be covered in a first conversation. When she left, she shook my hand. Her grip was firm. The text from Brendan arrived on a Tuesday morning in September, 14 months after the arrest, 3 months earlier than his projected release date. "Good behavior," Miriam told me later, which was a phrase I contemplated for longer than it perhaps warranted. The text was 6 words. "Dad, I'm out. Can we talk?" I read it at the restoration table. The morning light coming through the south window at the particular angle it took in September. Warm and slightly amber, the light that made the leather glow and the gold tooling catch. Ruth Gallagher was due on Saturday. I had 3 commissions on the table. The Novak Fellowship's 2nd year was beginning. 5 recipients this time. The application essays arriving in batches that I read in the evenings. I set the phone down and looked at the harbor. Then I picked it up again and typed a single word. Saturday. He arrived at 8 o'clock exactly. I had opened the workshop at 7, as usual, and was working on a commission, a 19th century hymn book. The covers detached, the text block intact but fragile, the kind of work that required patience more than skill when I heard the knock. Not the door chime that customers used, but a knock on the glass of the workshop window, the way someone knocks when they're not certain they have the right to use the door. I set down the bone folder and went to let him in. 14 months had changed Brendan Novak in ways that photographs would have captured, but that photographs couldn't have conveyed accurately. He was thinner, not alarmingly, but noticeably. The way a person thins when the energy required to maintain a certain performance of themselves is no longer available. He wore jeans and a canvas jacket, not unlike the one Ruth Gallagher wore on her first Saturday in this workshop, which I noticed and said nothing about. He had not had the haircut that money can reliably provide. He looked, standing in the doorway of a workshop on Congress Street on a September morning, like someone who had been pared back to something more accurate. He looked in certain ways like the 12-year-old boy who had stood at his mother's grave in a suit that was too large for him. Dad. He stopped there. He had apparently decided, or been advised, to begin with that single word and wait to see what came back. "Come in," I said. I stepped back from the door. He entered the way people entered who understood that they were guests carefully. Without claiming the space, looking at the tools and the shelves and the work on the table with attention that had nothing performative in it. He stood near the door and did not move further until I indicated the stool beside the restoration table. He sat. I remained standing, which was not a power calculation, but simply where I had been. "I'm not here to ask for anything," he said. This was, I recognized, the same opening he had used when he'd called from the detention facility. "I'm not here asking for help," and I suspected it was something he had decided to lead with because it was true, or because he needed it to be true, or both. "I don't expect anything. I needed to come here. To this room. To say certain things while looking at you." "All right," I said. He looked at his hands for a moment. His hands were, I noticed, no longer the hands of a man who worked in an office. There were small calluses developing at the base of his fingers, the kind that came from manual labor. The facility, Miriam had mentioned, offered vocational programs. I didn't ask. "I've been trying to write to you again," he said. 3 times since the first letter. I couldn't finish any of them. Everything I wrote felt like it was trying to do something, trying to get something, or prove something, or position something. He paused. I thought maybe if I came and said it out loud, it would just be what it was. "Say it then." He looked up. "I chose to become someone who hurt people because it was easier than becoming someone who acknowledged that he was hurting. I chose it deliberately, and I maintained it deliberately, and the fact that I understood why I was doing it, the shame, the distance, all of it, the self-awareness didn't make it less of a choice. I want you to know I understand that." I waited. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said. "I don't think I've earned the right to ask for it. But I wanted to look at you and say I'm sorry, not sorry. I got caught. Not sorry for what I lost. Sorry for the thing itself, for what I did to you and to those people." He held my gaze steadily. "That's all." The workshop was quiet. Outside, the September light was moving across the south window the way it did at this hour. Warm and particular, the light Ruth Gallagher had described in her 3rd week here as the reason she understood why I worked in this specific room rather than a larger one. I thought about what I wanted to say. I took my time with this, because the words that came first were not always the right ones. And what was said in this room in the next 2 minutes would be, in some ways, the last page of something. Last pages deserve the same care as first ones. "I believe you mean that," I said finally. "Whether that remains true in 5 years or 10, whether the person you're becoming is actually different from the person you've been, I can't know that from one morning in a workshop. Neither can you." I sat down on the stool across the table from him. "What I can tell you is that the door to this room isn't closed, but it opens slowly. It opens through time and through what you do with it, not through what you say." He nodded. He seemed to have expected something in this range. Not warmth, not rejection, but the honest middle ground of something that could not be resolved in a single conversation. "Is there anything you'd want from me?" he asked. "To start. To show you I'm working on it." I thought of Ruth Gallagher, arriving each Saturday at 7:58 with nothing, learning to fold a signature clean. I thought of the hymn book on the table behind me, covers detached, waiting. I thought of my father in Prague, teaching me that restoration was not about returning a thing to what it had been that was impossible, but about making it sound enough to endure. "There are books that need binding," I said. "If you want to learn, I teach on Saturdays. 8 o'clock. Bring nothing. You'll learn faster, without assumptions." He looked at me for a long moment. Something moved across his face that I didn't try to name. 8 o'clock, he said. 8 o'clock. He stood. He didn't extend his hand, which was the right instinct. Some gestures needed to be earned before they were offered. He walked to the door, paused with his hand on the frame. "The scholarship fund," he said. "The one named after Grandma and Grandpa. I read about it." A pause. "It's good work." "Yes," I said. "It is." He left. I listened to his footsteps on the sidewalk outside, fading toward Congress Street, toward whatever came next for him, the long, slow, uncertain work of becoming someone whose actions matched his words, which was the only work that ultimately counted. I turned back to the hymn book. On the shelf above the restoration table, in its velvet box with the tarnished brass hinge, Ruth's sapphire ring caught the morning light, small and blue, and exactly where it had always belonged. Beside it, the photograph of her at 23 in the doorway of this shop, a stack of books against her hip, squinting into the sunlight, smiling at the person behind the camera. That person had been me. That person was still me. I picked up the bone folder and returned to work. The harbor was visible through the south window, the islands low on the horizon. The September water moving in the particular way it moved when autumn was coming, purposeful, indifferent to what had happened on the shore, committed only to the direction it was going. My name is Walter Novak. I am 66 years old. I bind books for a living. I have bound the broken spines of 300-year-old manuscripts and the cracked boards of family Bibles and the water-damaged pages of books that most people would have called unsalvageable. I have learned that very few things are truly beyond repair, and that the ones that are will tell you so honestly if you pay attention. The work doesn't stop. The light keeps moving. The harbor keeps going. I pressed the fold clean and held it there.